The hall fell silent before the first word was even spoken. Cameras stopped clicking, delegates leaned forward, and in the heart of Ouagadougou, a Caribbean leader stood beside Africa's most defiant son. Today, he began, is not a day for politics. It is a day for courage. Those words, simple yet seismic, carried across oceans. For the first time in modern history, a prime minister from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, stood before President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso and the entire African Union. Not to negotiate, not to advise, but to apologize. And this was no empty gesture. It came with a $600 million reparative commitment, the first of its kind, not aid, not charity, but an act of moral restoration. An apology measured not in dollars alone, but in justice, in dignity, in the shared history of two peoples once broken by the same chains. As the Jamaican flag rose beside the red and green of Burkina Faso, something historic unfolded, a bridge rebuilt across the Atlantic between two nations that had long been kept apart by silence. What does it mean when a small island nation dares to say what empires never could? What does it mean when the descendants of the enslaved reach out to those who never stopped fighting for freedom? Maybe this is not just a speech. Maybe it's the moment when history begins to heal itself. So stay with us as we uncover how this single act of humility from Jamaica could change the way the world looks at Africa, and how President Ibrahim Traoré turned apology into awakening. If you believe that truth is more powerful than diplomacy, if you believe that justice delayed is still justice worth fighting for, please share this story and subscribe. Because today we are witnessing not politics, but redemption. The morning light over Ouagadougou was soft, almost reverent. Flags from across Africa lined the avenue leading to the new Congress Hall, a place that for decades had hosted summits, military ceremonies, and political declarations. But this day was different. There were no soldiers in formation, no national anthems echoing in competition, only silence, the kind of silence that precedes history. When the Prime Minister of Jamaica entered the hall, he did not carry the swagger of politics. He carried something heavier: remorse. He looked at President Ibrahim Traoré and said, "Today is not a day for rehearsed lines or diplomatic posturing. It is a day for courage." Every word seemed to carve itself into the air. He spoke of centuries of injustice, of the systems that enriched some and impoverished many, of the global order built upon Africa's pain, and how Jamaica, though small, had been complicit through its silence. "We were wrong, profoundly wrong," he admitted. There was no applause at first, only stillness, and then slowly tears. Women in traditional Faso cloths wiped their faces. Elders nodded quietly. Some closed their eyes as if to absorb the weight of that confession. Then came the sentence that changed the rhythm of the room: Jamaica will make a reparative commitment of $600 million to the government and people of Burkina Faso. A wave of astonishment rippled through the audience. Even foreign journalists lowered their cameras. It wasn't the money that stunned them. It was the motive. This, he continued, is not charity. It is not foreign aid. It is moral clarity. It is the understanding that reconciliation without restoration is empty. The Prime Minister's voice trembled slightly, not from weakness, but conviction. He turned toward Traoré and said something that would be replayed across African airwaves for days. "Your nation, under your leadership, has become a symbol of courage in an age where silence masquerades as diplomacy." It was a moment of rare humility between two nations that decades ago would never have met as equals. He described how, as a boy, he had learned that Africa was poor, and how, as a man, he realized Africa had only been made poor by design, by systems that extracted wealth, punished independence, and rewrote history to glorify the powerful. He confessed that post-colonial nations like Jamaica had in many ways cooperated with those structures, not always willingly, but undeniably. That was why this apology mattered: not to erase history, but to face it. It is not about guilt, he said. It is about justice. And with that, he announced how the $600 million would be delivered in 5 years unconditionally, to be used at the discretion of the Burkina people. No supervision, no oversight, no hidden clauses. For the first time, he said, "We are not here to shape your development narrative. We are here to return what was stolen: respect." President Traoré did not interrupt. He sat motionless, hands folded, his face calm but unreadable. Yet when the Prime Minister turned toward him and said, "You have shown the world that a people willing to endure hardship for dignity are stronger than empires built on deceit," Traoré looked up and nodded. The audience erupted. Applause thundered through the hall for nearly 3 minutes. And for a fleeting instant, it was as if the Atlantic Ocean, that ancient wound separating Africa and the Caribbean, had begun to heal. As the ceremony ended, the two leaders stood side by side before a massive bronze plaque bearing the inscription, "Reparation is not a gift. It is a return of truth." No one in that room doubted it. They had just witnessed something the world had never seen before, a nation once enslaved and another once colonized finally meeting, not in guilt, but in equality. And across the world, millions who watched the broadcast whispered the same thought: if Jamaica could find the courage to say sorry. What stops the rest of us? The sound of thunderous applause still lingered in the air long after the Prime Minister left the podium. But something deeper than applause had filled that room, a tremor of awakening. For decades, Africa had listened to apologies that came with conditions, speeches that came with contracts, promises that faded before they were fulfilled. This time was different. The voice asking for forgiveness did not come from Europe or Washington. It came from the Caribbean, a place born from the same chains that once scarred Africa's soil. When the Prime Minister declared, "We are not rescuing Burkina Faso. We are repairing history," the hall erupted again, not out of courtesy, but catharsis. A weight seemed to lift from generations who had waited for anyone to say those words with conviction. Across the aisles, diplomats whispered to one another. Representatives from Mali and Niger rose to their feet applauding. Delegates from the African Union embraced. And even among the Western observers, journalists, analysts, political aides, there was a kind of stunned silence, as if they were watching an old world crumble in real time. For the people of Burkina Faso, the apology was not about the money. It was about recognition of the suffering, of the manipulation of the centuries when their labor-fed empires that called them undeveloped. To hear a leader from across the Atlantic say we were wrong was to hear the echo of a new moral order. Outside the hall, tens of thousands gathered in Ouagadougou's Independence Square. Giant screens streamed the event live. Women waved both Jamaican and Burkinabe flags tied together by a single red ribbon. Students chanted, "Justice begins with truth." In that crowd stood old men who had fought under Thomas Sankara, their faces glistening with tears because they knew this moment was the continuation of a dream once interrupted. And somewhere within that same square, an old radio vendor whispered, "Sankara planted the seed. Traoré watered it. And today Jamaica helped it bloom." Inside the Congress Hall, President Ibrahim Traoré finally rose to speak. He did not have a written speech. He did not walk to the podium. He simply turned toward the Prime Minister and said, "We do not forgive because we are weak. We forgive because we are free." The audience gasped. The Prime Minister bowed slightly, a small gesture, yet one that carried centuries of meaning. Traoré continued, "For too long the world has told Africa to forget. But how do you forget what was never repaired? Today we begin not by forgetting but by remembering together." It was a rare sight, a young African soldier and an aging Caribbean statesman, two men separated by generations, joined by a single truth that dignity cannot be outsourced. As Traoré stepped forward, he placed his hand on the Jamaican flag. The crowd stood in silence once more. Then, like a storm-breaking chant filled the hall, "Africa, Jamaica, one people." One Destiny television networks across the world replayed that scene for days. CNN called it a symbolic gesture with real geopolitical consequences. France 24 described it as a moral earthquake across the global south. And in Washington, think tanks began asking a nervous question: if Jamaica can do this, who will be next? But perhaps the most powerful reaction didn't come from the halls of diplomacy, it came from ordinary people. In Port-au-Prince, youth movements carried signs reading "Caribbean with Africa." In Lagos, a street artist painted Traoré and the Jamaican Prime Minister shaking hands beneath the words, "Reparation is restoration." And in Harlem, New York, descendants of African slaves lit candles in tribute to what they called the day the Atlantic was healed. This was no longer just a political event. It had become a moral contagion, spreading across borders, faiths, and languages. For the first time, the story of Africa and her diaspora was being written not in sorrow, but in solidarity. And as night fell over Ouagadougou, thousands of phones lit up the square, glowing like stars, symbols of a new constellation where nations once divided by oceans now stood connected by conscience. "Let this be the beginning," Traore said softly, "not of charity, but of justice reborn." And in that moment the applause that followed was not just for a speech, it was for a turning point in history. In the days that followed, the world could not stop talking about Ouagadougou. News anchors called it a miracle in the Sahel. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it was more than news. It was validation, the feeling that their pain had finally been seen and their dignity restored before the eyes of the world. Across the capital, murals appeared overnight. One showed President Ibrahim Traoré and the Jamaican Prime Minister standing on a bridge made of chains, the chains melting into rivers of gold and wheat. Below it, in bold red letters, someone had written, "We are no longer the forgotten." Within a week, community radios began airing the speech on repeat. Teachers played it in classrooms. In churches and mosques, clerics called the apology a lesson in humility the world must learn. And in every market stall from Ouagadougou to Bobo Dioulasso, the same sentence kept echoing. See, if they could say sorry, then maybe the world is changing. But this was not just emotional, it was political. The Burkina Parliament, inspired by the apology, passed a resolution declaring National Restoration Week a week devoted to remembering Africa's colonial scars and celebrating independence of thought. Youth organizations demanded that the $600 million fund be directed toward education, healthcare, and women-led enterprises, not foreign contractors. For the first time in years, the country's public debates were not about war, but about what to build next. President Traoré announced the creation of a Burkina-Jamaica Reparative Council composed equally of young economists, traditional chiefs, and cultural figures. Their mission was not to administer aid, but to reimagine sovereignty, to use the money as a seed for local industry and self-reliance. The Prime Minister of Jamaica kept his promise. There would be no oversight, only partnership. And true to his word, the first installment, $120 million, arrived without any clause, any signature from the IMF or any Western intermediary. That in itself was revolutionary. Because for decades, African nations had been told that every dollar must come with approval, with governance conditions, performance indicators, and reform obligations. But this time, there was only trust, and trust in diplomacy was more valuable than gold. The ripple effect spread across the Caribbean. In Barbados, Prime Minister Mia Mottley praised the move, calling it the first moral act of the post-colonial age. Trinidad and Tobago formed a task force to explore their own reparative commitments. In Africa, Mali and Niger signaled their interest in joining a South-South reparative alliance, a partnership based not on trade, but on shared healing. Still, not everyone celebrated. Western think tanks warned of dangerous precedents. Financial analysts predicted that Jamaica's credit rating might drop. Some accused the Prime Minister of moral populism. But the people in both Jamaica and Burkina Faso didn't care about ratings or markets. They cared that for once their leaders had chosen conscience over convenience. In Ouagadougou, a 23-year-old student named Awa summed it up best during a street interview. "This isn't just about money. It's about seeing ourselves again as a people with worth." Her words spread online, viewed millions of times. And suddenly, a new movement began trending across the continent, genre's Repair Africa. Governments debated, intellectuals argued, and activists mobilized. But beneath it all was something far more powerful, a quiet shift in identity. Burkina Faso was no longer just a nation under siege or survival. It had become a moral compass for the world, and Traoré its steady hand on the helm. And in Kingston, Jamaica, as church bells rang that Sunday morning, the Prime Minister told his congregation, "We have not lost by giving. We have gained our soul." When the story reached the United States, it caught Washington by surprise. Few had expected a small island nation like Jamaica to upstage the great powers on the moral stage. The headline spoke louder than any official statement. Jamaica apologizes for history. The West looks away. In think tanks across D.C., analysts debated what it meant. Could a $600 million gesture from a Caribbean state truly matter in a world dominated by trillion-dollar economies? But the question they were really asking was simpler and more uncomfortable. What if others follow? Because in that one act, Jamaica had done something no Western nation had dared to do. It had admitted complicity, not with guilt, but with integrity. It had used the language of justice, not charity. And in doing so, it had challenged the entire moral foundation of the global order. CNN called it a diplomatic tremor with historical echoes. The Washington Post wondered aloud, has the moral center of the post-colonial world shifted south? In the halls of the United Nations, murmurs spread. African diplomats who once sat quietly now spoke with renewed confidence. They quoted Traoré's words, "Dignity is not for sale." Even Latin American and Asian delegations began to cite the Jamaica-Burkina model as proof that global South nations could build alliances based not on dependency, but on moral equity. Meanwhile, in Paris, the mood was uneasy. France 24 described the event as a symbolic revolt against centuries of European paternalism. Officials privately feared the Jamaica effect, that African countries might now reject traditional aid packages and demand reparative partnerships instead. For the old powers, this was not just political, it was existential. In the United Kingdom university, students launched campaigns demanding their government follow suit. They held signs reading, "If Jamaica can say sorry, so can you." Scholars compared the moment to South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation era, but this time, reconciliation crossed oceans. Across the Atlantic, the African diaspora in the U.S. felt something shift. In Harlem, churches rang bells in solidarity. In Atlanta, community leaders held vigils calling the moment a rebirth of Pan-African conscience. And in cities like Detroit and Baltimore, descendants of the enslaved wrote open letters to Congress demanding America's own reckoning. A retired U.S. senator speaking anonymously admitted, "The Jamaica-Burkina moment embarrassed us. We talk about democracy, but we have never truly apologized for empire." And perhaps that was the real power of this moment. Not the $600 million, not the applause, but the silence that followed, a silence in Washington, London, and Brussels, where moral clarity had suddenly become inconvenient. For once, the leadership that inspired the world didn't come from the G7, the IMF, or NATO. It came from two nations that for centuries had been told they were too small to matter. And yet, as night fell over New York, the lights of Times Square flickered with a digital headline from Reuters that said it all: "Jamaica and Burkina Faso remind the world morality still has a price." To many Americans watching from afar, especially those who still believe in the power of truth, the question now was not, why did Jamaica do this? It was, why haven't we? As the cameras faded and the crowd dispersed, something lingered in the air over Ouagadougou, something no lens could capture. It wasn't pride, it was peace. The kind of peace that comes only when truth is finally spoken aloud. In the weeks that followed, the world's attention shifted elsewhere, to wars, to elections, to markets. But for those who had watched that ceremony live, nothing looked quite the same again. Because they had witnessed what many thought impossible, a moral realignment of history, a small Caribbean nation extending its hand across the Atlantic, and a young African leader accepting it not as charity, but as equality. And yet beneath the hope, there was also a warning. The Prime Minister had said it clearly: what we cannot afford is silence. Silence is what built the empires. Silence is what kept nations poor while the rich wrote the rules. And silence is what allows injustice to survive in plain sight. In the United States, that warning felt uncomfortably close to home. For decades, America has spoken of democracy, freedom, and justice. But in that single moment between Jamaica and Burkina Faso, the world saw something the superpowers had long forgotten: humility as strength. President Ibrahim Traoré called it the first day of the era of truth. For him, it wasn't about the money, the headlines, or the applause. It was about reclaiming the moral voice of Africa and reminding the world that justice cannot be outsourced and dignity cannot be delayed. Across the global South, murals of Traoré and the Jamaican Prime Minister now adorn walls like sacred icons. Children memorize their words in school. And in the quiet corners of old colonial capitals, uncomfortable questions have begun to rise. If they can face their past, why can't we? Maybe that is what true leadership looks like: not power, but repentance; not wealth, but courage. And as this story echoes from Ouagadougou to Washington, it leaves one haunting question for all of us. Will we wait another century for justice, or will we dare to begin it now? Because what happened in that hall wasn't just history, it was prophecy. A prophecy that justice is no longer in the hands of the powerful, but in the hearts of the brave. If you believe that truth still matters more than image, if you believe that President Ibrahim Traoré's vision of dignity and sovereignty speaks for all humanity, then share this story. Subscribe if you believe justice begins when silence ends. Let the world remember this moment when a soldier and a statesman reminded us that the moral compass of humanity still points south.